high, little help from my friends. I get high, little help from my friends. Oh, I get high, little help from my friends. I get high, little help from my friends. We get try, little help from my friends. Little help from my friends.
I love those guys. That was Keep Alive doing their version of the Beatles song with a little help from my friends. One of the verses there was in Hebrew. And in their music video on YouTube, they're at Leket, which is the National Food Bank in Israel. Boxing surplus vegetables and making sure that they don't go to waste, but rather go to people who need them and will eat them. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Let there be light. All right, who is with us as we do a little beautiful learning on a Thursday evening? We're already getting into a Shabbos frame of mind. Tomorrow's Erev Shabbos. Who's with us on a Thursday night? Pauline in Arkansas, James in Indianapolis, Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in New York, Renee in Indy, John in Sedona, Crystal in Canada, John in Sedona says Shalom Haver, Bill in Arkansas. Until next Friday when I start back for Berkeley, God willing, may you have a safe trip. Rochelle says Erev Tov from Modesto. Paula in Chicago. Kathy says Shalom, Mr. and Mrs. Litvak and everyone. Oh, we're just Sal and Nina. Mr. and Mrs. Litvak are my parents. Patrice Carter says Shalom from Utah. Donna in Bahama, North Carolina. Ann in Merced. Tom in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Paula in Oregon, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Harold in Loretta in Oregon, I believe, Peggy in Corona, Dorothy in Pittsburgh, Nancy in Southern Pines, Janice in Dallas, and Brinna says Erev Tov, and I know Brinna's in Sharon, Massachusetts, right, Brinna? Over there on the YouTube side, Gigi in British Columbia, and Lynn in Texas. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. Where are we? We are holding, this is Daf Ayin Hey, that's page 75 of Tractate Pesachim. These are the laws of Passover. We're in the second half dealing with the Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb, Passover sacrifice that was brought when the temple was standing. We are in chapter 7 and today completing our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 7. And we're talking about how you cook the Korban Pesach, right? Because the Korban Pesach is an offering that we eat. Only a little bit of it, the small sacrificial parts, a little bit go up on the altar, a little bit of the blood gets sprinkled on the altar, but the vast majority of the offering, whether it's a lamb or a young goat, is eaten by the group of people that are registered to it. It says very specifically in the Torah, first of all, we can only bring this offering when the temple is standing, so we haven't done this in 2,000 years, but when the temple is standing, it says specifically in the Torah that it must be, the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, must be roasted in fire. And so now our sages are figuring out, well, what exactly does it mean? How does it need to be cooked so that the people who are registered in a group to eat that particular lamb or goat will be permitted to eat it because it's been cooked properly. It wasn't disqualified through the cooking process. Our Mishnah basically is making 2 points. We discussed the first point yesterday, that when you cook this meat, you're going to put it on a spit. And the spit needs to be made out of wood and not metal. A wooden spit that doesn't emit water, so that it would be water vapor. Why? Because it has to be roasted, not cooked or boiled or, cooked, prepared in some other way than roasted in the fire. So if you put it on a metal spit, the sages were concerned that the part of the metal spit which is outside the animal but which is over the fire will get super hot, red hot even. It will conduct the heat down into the metal that's inside the roasting lamb. And so that part which is touching the metal wouldn't be cooked by roasting in the fire. It would be getting cooked by the transmission of heat down that metal spit. And then in terms of which kind of wood, the Mishnah specified pomegranate wood because it is a very dry wood that doesn't give up its moisture easily. And so the animal where it's touching that wood isn't going to be steamed, as it were. Now we're in the second part of our discussion of this Mishnah. And the Mishnah said, it was a short Mishnah, but it made this second point, that one may not roast the Paschal lamb on the metal spit nor on a metal grill. However, Rabbi Tzadok said there was an incident with Rabban Gamliel, who said to his slave Tavi, "Go and roast the Paschal lamb for us on a grill." So Rabban Gamliel, who's the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, he obviously knows the law, knows it very well. We can rely on what Rabban Gamliel is doing, and if it's not permitted to cook it on a grill, then how is it that he's saying to his servant, "Go cook the Paschal lamb on a grill"? How is that possible? And that is what we're going to be discussing today. All right, let me get this in front of me here. So it was taught in the Mishnah that one may not roast the Paschal lamb on a grill. Subsequently, the Mishnah quotes an incident in which Rabban Gamliel instructed his servant to roast the Paschal lamb for him on a grill. And the Gemara expresses surprise at this. Was an incident cited to contradict that which was previously stated? And the Gemara responds, the Mishnah is incomplete, and it is teaching the following. And if it is a perforated grill, so that the fire reaches each part of the meat and the animal will not be roasted from the heat of the grill itself, it is permitted. And with regard to this, Rabbi Tzadok said that there was an incident with Rabban Gamliel, who said to his slave Tavi, "Go and roast the Paschal lamb for us on the perforated grill." So I guess what we're distinguishing here is between a grill like on a barbecue, where it's just, slats of metal, but there's lots of space between the metal, and the fire of the grill comes right up between the slats of metal, and that's what's essentially roasting the meat. And that is permitted. As opposed to, sometimes we call it a grill. I don't know what it would actually be called, but like, for instance, I was once a short order chef in a Friendly's. If you remember Friendly's, there was one in the Washington, D.C. area. I had that job for 2 weeks. Horrible job. But anyway, there was a flat, just like a absolute flat metal grill, the kind that you would cook eggs on and other kinds of, other kinds of meat and sausages, bacon, etc., hamburgers. And then when that part of the job, just doing the cooking, wasn't so terrible. It was hot, but it wasn't so terrible. What made the job terrible was at the end of the day, I had to clean that grill with some kind of chemical. It was awful. So it's a very hot grill. It had been super hot all day long. You turn it off at the end of the day, but it's still hot. And then you put this chemical on it to clean it, and that vapor would come up. It gets in your eyes. Awful job. I was much happier when I became a waiter at an El Torito restaurant in the Washington area. I made a lot more money too. At any rate, so if we're talking about that kind of flat metal grill, that's no good for cooking the Paschal lamb, right? Because now the fire is not cooking the grill. Now the fire is not cooking the lamb. The fire would be heating up that expanse of metal, and then that metal is what would be cooking the lamb. So in terms of a grill, a holy grill is a holy grill, meaning a grill with holes, perforated, lots of space for the fire to come up, that would be permitted. In other words, barbecue lamb seems to be okay for cooking the Paschal lamb. The Gemara cites a discussion related to the subject of roasting the Paschal lamb. Rav Chinana bar Edi, so Rav Chinana, the son of Edi, raised a dilemma before Rav Ada bar Ahava in the case of an oven that one fired with peels of fruit that are orla, i.e. fruit that grows on a tree the first 3 years after it was planted, from which one may not receive any benefit. If after the oven became very hot, he swept it and removed the fuel and the ashes, and he baked bread in it, according to the opinion that prohibits bread baked directly with heat from orla fuel, what is the law with regard to this bread? It was baked with heat trapped in the oven only after the fuel was removed. And he said to him, meaning Rav Ada bar Ahava said to him, the bread is permitted. Let's just repeat that because it's a little bit confusing. So first of all, orla means the fruit from a tree that is less than 4 years old, right? Any fruit tree in its first 3 years, it is prohibited for a Jew by Torah law not only to eat the fruit from a tree in its first 3 years, but to even benefit from it. You can't even benefit from it. So if a person took an oven, and an oven in Talmudic times, right, it was like a large clay oven, and there's a fire inside the oven, like a wood fire usually. It's big enough so there's a wood fire in there, and then in the space adjacent to the wood fire is the thing that you're cooking. So if he fired that oven not using wood, but using the peels and husks and extra parts of this fruit from a 3-year tree, enough, and there's enough of it there, and it's dried out enough that you can make a fire out of it. Okay, so then he made benefit, right? He heated up that oven with the husks and peels of prohibited fruit. Prohibited because it comes from a tree less than 4 years old. But then he removes the fuel. He got the oven really hot, but then he removed that fuel. So definitely, the oven got heated up with the peels and husks of that fire, but then he removed the source of the heat before he put the bread inside to bake in that oven. So then would the bread be permitted? For sure, if he left the husks and peels of orla inside that oven and baked the bread inside it, the bread would be prohibited. But strangely, this is surprising, it's counterintuitive, even though the oven was heated with this fuel that is prohibited to use, now it's hot, the fuel gets removed, he bakes the bread in there, and it turns out that it's permitted. This is surprising to us. Now the question, of course, is why are we learning that law here in the context of learning about a grill? Let's continue. Rav Hinana said to him, but didn't Rav Hinana the elder say, I guess he's just named after this guy, maybe it's his grandfather, but Rav Hinana said to him, but didn't Rav Hinana the elder say that Rab Asi said, that Rabbi Yochanan said? So Rabbi Yochanan now is a Tana of the Mishnaic period. He's being cited in a chain of transmission by some of the Amoraim, these later rabbis of the Gemara, rabbis of the Talmudic period. So if there is an oven that one fired and swept so that the heat remains, but there is no longer any fire in the oven, and one then roasted the Paschal lamb in it, this is not a fulfillment of the Torah's command that the Paschal lamb must be roasted in fire, as it is stated in the Torah. And this is the key line that everything that we're talking about depends on. This is Exodus 12:8 and 9. And they shall eat the meat on that night, roasted in fire, and matzos, with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled in water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and with its inner parts. Exodus 12:8 and 9. And since it says the phrase roasted in fire twice, the verse emphasizes that the Paschal lamb must literally be roasted on the fire. Right, so here now we understand why we're bringing in this example of the oven that was heated with a fire made from a prohibited substance, the peels and husks of orla fruit. And we saw that even though he fired the oven with it, once he removed that fuel, any bread that was baked in that oven is not prohibited. It turns out that it's permitted. Now we have this other idea where you had proper fire, right? You had a wood fire in this oven, you heated it up super hot, then you removed the wood fire, the fuel that was making the oven hot, and then you put that Paschal lamb in there and roasted it. right? So it's not next to a fire. The fire's gone. The oven is still hot. Would we be fulfilling our obligation to roast the lamb over fire? The oven was heated with a wood fire, but the fire is no longer there. That's the question. And here I'll just read the law even before we go forward. The halacha is a paschal lamb roasted in an oven that has been swept. If one fired an oven with wood and then removed the wood, he is prohibited from roasting a paschal lamb in it because it would not be considered roasted over a fire. So if you remove the fuel, right, it's considered that you're not cooking it over that fuel. And now we can understand a little bit better. So when we bake the bread in an oven that was made hot by a fire made from orla, he shouldn't have done that. It was prohibited. But now that the orla, the husks and peels of that prohibited fruit are swept out of the oven, okay, it's just a hot oven, and you're not cooking it over the orla husks and peels. It does make sense. These two rulings seem to be consistent with each other. So the following can now be inferred. The reason, with regard to you can't cook the paschal lamb in this oven once you swept the wood fire out of it, the reason is specifically because the merciful one reveals this halacha, this law, with regard to the paschal lamb in the Torah by repeating roasted in fire, right? That's Exodus 12, chapter 12, verses 8 and 9. Both verses include roasted in fire. As I said before, the Torah says, and they shall eat, and they shall eat the meat on that night, roasted in fire. And matzahs, with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled in water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and with its inner parts. So since the Torah repeated roasted in fire, we have to pay special attention whenever the Torah repeats something. It's not just to emphasize it and say, hey, knucklehead, make sure you listen. Whenever the Torah has extra words, seemingly superfluous words, the sages are going to pay laser-like attention on that repetition and see what is actually being taught. So, since the merciful one reveals with regard to the paschal lamb in his Torah by repeating roasted in fire twice, if the merciful one had not revealed this law by emphasizing the need to roast it directly on the fire, I would have said a paschal lamb roasted in an oven that has already been swept is nonetheless considered roasted in fire, right? Because what made the oven hot? The wood fire that was in it. Therefore, in other situations in which something is roasted in an oven, even if it is not roasted directly from the heat of a fire, its status should be comparable to something that was roasted directly from the fuel. If the fuel is forbidden, the food should be forbidden. But since it says roasted in fire twice, we know it has to be roasted directly over fire. Is that true about the command that you can't benefit from orla in any way? Maybe in that situation, the fact that the oven was heated from that prohibited fuel, it should still make the food prohibited because that food doesn't have this, this strict command that it has to be roasted in fire. It has to be roasted in fire. That applies to the paschal lamb. Are we going to learn out from the law of the paschal lamb with regard to this fuel of orla, with regard to bread? Let's read the law there. If one fueled the fire in an oven with peels of orla, from which one may not derive benefit, and then he removed the peels and the ashes and only then baked the bread in the oven, the bread is permitted. The bread is permitted. Nevertheless, according to the Vilna Gaon, this may not be done ab initio. It might be permitted, but you should not be planning to do it this way. And of course, it was prohibited to make a fire. There you made a transgression. When you use the orla to make a fire that benefited you, there you violated a Torah prohibition, so you'd be liable to bring a sin offering if you did that unwittingly. then it's a second question of whether if he swept out that fire and the oven was still hot, could he bake bread in it? And apparently you could, it would be permitted, but it is not something that we should do, even though it's permitted. Rav Ada bar Ahava said to Rav Hinana bar Idi, the merciful one reveals it there with regard to the Paschal lamb, and we learn from it that even in other areas of halacha, only something that is roasted directly by a fire is considered roasted in fire. So that's where we get the law that the bread would be permitted even once we sweep the orla fire out of that oven. And if you wish, say a different answer instead. There, in the case of the Paschal lamb, the reason one may not roast the lamb if one has already swept out the oven is that the merciful one writes roasted in fire twice. But if the merciful one had not written roasted in fire twice, I would have said that the merciful one is particular about fire, meaning that the source of the heat in the oven should be fire. And even if one swept it, it is still considered roasted in fire. It was therefore necessary to repeat the phrase roasted in fire. But here, in the case of orla, the merciful one is particular about the prohibited fuel, and it is not here in the oven. Therefore, there is no reason to prohibit the bread. So that's kind of two different ways to logically arrive at the conclusion. But the fact of the matter is, we've seen what the law is. If you heated up the oven with orla and then you got all the fuel and ashes out of there, it would be permitted to bake bread, even though you shouldn't do it. It would be the bread would be permitted. But for sure, if you heated up an oven and then took the fire out and cooked the Paschal lamb in it, you would have disqualified the Paschal lamb, and now nobody would be permitted to eat it. The sages taught. Now we're going to go a little bit. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the nature of this fire. Now, so far we've been saying, well, fire implies that wood is burning and there's a fire and the lamb is roasted on the fire. Now we're going to ask, well, what if, the wood fire is actually coals? Or maybe wood coals, is that going to be permitted? What if the coals are made of some other substance that's not wood? Is that going to be considered fire? And we're actually going to, in order to understand this question, we're going to make a little digression into the law of capital punishment, where the punishment is burning, right? So there are some crimes in the Torah where if you commit them, you're liable to be executed, and the particular kind of execution is burning. But it is not and remember, in terms of capital punishment in the Torah, first, it never happens today. And even in the ancient kingdom of Israel, where the Torah law was the law, an execution at the hands of a rabbinic court just about never happened. Why? Because as we've discussed before, for you to be actually executed by a court at the time that you were committing the crime, which is punishable by death, somebody had to say to you, if you commit that crime, you will be liable to the death penalty. And then you did it immediately after you heard the warning. And there were two people there who not only witnessed the crime, but witnessed you receiving the warning. And then that you did it anyway. If all those factors aren't there, no death penalty. All right, so just keep that in mind. The sages taught, if one cuts the Paschal lamb superficially in several places and places it on coals, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, I say that this is considered roasted in fire, as coals have the status of real fire. Rav Achadvoy bar Ami raised a contradiction to Rav Chizda. Did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi actually say that coals are considered like fire? So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, also known as Rebbe, the editor of the Mishna, the one responsible for getting it down on paper, the first sort of writing down of the oral tradition, he said that if you cook it over coals, and then he also says if you make superficial cuts on it. So presumably it's like you're just making little cuts on this whole lamb so that the heat will get inside better. And that doesn't seem to affect the cooking. It's still the heat is coming from the fire. But he's also saying that if they're coals, that the heat is coming from coals, that is considered like fire. So, more like a barbecue, right? And that is the law. Okay, so that law is not challenged. If one cuts it and places it on coals, if one made cuts in the Paschal lamb and placed it on coals, it is considered to be roasted over a fire. Although this is the opinion of only one of the sages, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with his opinion because no conflicting opinion is cited. So you can do that. But now that Rebbe has said, so you can, if you roast it over coals, that is considered roasting it over fire. So Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami is gonna object. He's gonna raise a contradiction based on the Torah's statement with regard to the laws of leprosy. All right. So for this to make sense, remember that the Quran translates tzara'as as leprosy, but it's not leprosy the way we think of it. This is a skin condition, which is basically a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, often associated with evil speech, lashon hara, speaking with a wicked tongue, either gossiping about others, slandering others, libeling others, etc. Somebody who just uses his mouth in a very unspiritual and destructive manner. When we were living at such a high spiritual level as when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, so then their skin eventually might break out, and then they would have to go through a pretty complex purification process. Now, if somebody had one of these breakouts on their skin and there were certain kinds of white and red marks, so then you would have to call a Kohen, a priest, who was qualified in the laws of tzara'as to examine the marking, the blotch on a person's skin. Maybe it's just eczema, maybe it's just a pimple, maybe it's just acne, maybe it's just, whatever, or maybe it's tzara'as. So a priest has to come over and look at it, and if he says, yes, that does look like tzara'as, then you would be in quarantine for 7 days, then he would come back and look at it again. And if that mark was still there or had expanded or whatever the Torah says, and the priest sees the marks, he would then say, yes, you have tzara'as, and then you have to be completely isolated from the community, living in isolation, going through a somewhat difficult and long purification process until, the tzara'as would clear up. And then you could come back, and then you would be liable to bring some offerings in the temple. That's why there's no more tzara'as when there's no temple, because then you couldn't, you could not complete your purification. Okay, so in terms of these marks, the Torah is also specific that if a person, where the mark appears on your skin is significant, because if it just appears on a regular piece of skin, okay, but if it appears in a part of your body where you've had, where you had a wound, like by a burn, then the qualifications of that marking to constitute tzara'as would be different. And there's actually some distinctions between the types of burn. And so if you had a burn from a fire and a burn from acid, right, something like that, then if you had these tzara'as markings on those two parts of your body, one that had been burned by a fire and one that had been burned by acid, so those two marks wouldn't combine to constitute the minimum measure of how big a marking needed to be in order for the priest to say, yes, you have tzara'as. And so that's why they're making this distinction with regard to the laws of leprosy, really tzara'as, that you have to understand where the burn came from and what constitutes a burn. That's a little background so you understand what we're talking about here. Okay, so Rav Achavdoi Bar Ami raised a contradiction based on the Torah's statement with regard to the laws of tzara'as. Or Leviticus 13:24, quote, or flesh that shall have on its skin a burn from fire. From the fact that it says a burn from fire, I have derived nothing other than a case in which it is burned by fire itself. If it is burned by a coal, by burning ash, by burning lime, by burning plaster, or by anything else that is burning and whose source of heat comes from fire, to include also water heated by fire. Maybe you were scalded by boiling water. From where is it derived from where is it derived that these are also considered a burn from fire? The verse states a burn twice. By repeating the term, it includes all these types of burns. The following can now be inferred. The reason is that the Merciful One includes these types of burns in the Torah by repeating the words a burn. But if the Merciful One had not included them through the repetitive expression a burn, one would have assumed that coals are not considered fire, which would contradict the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi that any usage of the term fire includes coals as well, right? Let's remember what we're doing here. We understand the Paschal lamb has to be roasted over fire. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said that you can roast it over coals, right? So coals would seem to be a type of fire according to Rebbe. But now there's this contradiction from the laws of Tzara'as, which would seem to indicate that coals are included only because in that body of law, burn is stated twice, meaning that a coal fire isn't really a fire. The Torah had to add additional language for it to be included in the same law of burns. He said to him, with regard to a red-hot wood coal, it is not necessary for the verse to include it. As long as it is burning, it is certainly considered a fire. So that would just, that would handle this question about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi saying that you can roast the Paschal lamb over coals. If the coals are made from wood, right? Like if you had a wood fire burning for a long time, you had a lot of wood, that fire was going. After a while, you've got those hot coals. That's what's left in that fire. If you cook the lamb over that, that's definitely roasting it over fire because wood coals are considered fire. Okay, so that's that for sure. But where a verse is necessary is with regard to a red-hot piece of metal, right? A coal made out of metal that was heated by a fire. Without the verse, it would have been possible to think a person burned by hot metal is not considered burned by fire, right? So it would seem that, so the question that's being asked is, okay, well, if you heat metal red hot, right, and then you cook on it, is that considered roasted over fire? Now, it would seem like, well, no. I mean, we know that the grill has to be perforated so that the fire can come up through it. If you heat the grill red hot and cook the meat on that, that is not going to work. If it's not in the form of a flat grill, we also said that a metal spit running through the lamb, that's no good because it's going to transmit heat inside the lamb and it would be getting cooked by the metal that's red hot. So it would seem like metal coals should not work. But the Gemara expresses surprise at this answer. And are red-hot pieces of metal not considered fire? Aren't they considered fire? But with regard to a daughter of a priest who committed adultery after she was betrothed, it is written, this is Leviticus 21:9, and the daughter of a priest, if she profanes herself through adultery, she profanes her father, right, who is wearing the, he's invested with the authority of a priest. And so if the daughter of a priest commits adultery, the punishment in the Torah is that she shall be burned in the fire. So now, what does it mean that she's going to be burned in the fire? Does that mean burning at the stake? No, it does not mean that, as we'll see. In fire she shall be burned, Leviticus 21:9. And Rav Matana said they would not literally burn her in fire. Rather, they would prepare for her a molten bar of lead, and they would execute her by pouring molten lead down her throat. This proves that burning metal is considered fire. The Gemara responds, it is different there, as the verse states not simply fire, but specifically, in fire she shall be burned. The expression she shall be burned comes to include all burnings that come from fire. The Gemara suggests, if so, all the more so, fire itself fulfills the requirement of burning. Let us surround her with bundles of branches and burn her with them. Right? So if the Torah says she shall be burned in the fire she shall be burned, why don't they burn her at the stake? Why not? Right? It would seem like that's what it's asking for, and we said that burning seems to be burning with a wood fire. So why wouldn't the execution be by burning at the stake? And the Gemara responds, it comes from a verbal analogy between the word burning stated here and the word burning stated in the context of the death of the sons of Aaron. Right? Moses' brother Aaron, who was the first high priest, and his sons, right? I mean, the Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron, are the priests. And the first two priests in line for that were Nadav and Avihu, right? But they, while the children of Israel were wandering in the desert, as we learn in the Torah, they brought strange fire into the tabernacle. They were excited, perhaps, about being priests, and they got a little bit carried away, and they brought some kind of alien fire, strange fire, to the altar, and they died, right? And they died at the hand of God. God killed them. And so it was a fire that came from the altar and killed them. But were they, burned to a crisp and just ashes were left? No. Our tradition teaches that they were killed by this holy fire that came directly from God, but their bodies were intact. Instead, it was their souls that were killed. And how did God accomplish that? It was some kind of a stream of holy fire, some kind of, spiritual, miraculous fire that came out of the altar and went into their nostrils. It killed them, but it left their bodies intact. And now what the sages are teaching is that if it should ever happen that the daughter of a priest, right, would commit adultery in a situation where somebody said to her, if you commit adultery, you're going to be liable to the death penalty, and there were two witnesses there, and then she did it anyway, and then she became liable to execution, so she's going to be, and then the punishment is burning. But like the sons of Aaron, she shouldn't have her body burned up so that only ashes are left, right? We don't believe in cremation. So what would they do instead? They would pour this molten lead down her throat so that the body would be preserved, even though she dies. I mean, it's, she's still getting executed. I'm reminded, I once made a movie about Henry VIII when I was in film school, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, was sentenced to die. And rather than use some kind of the headsman, you normally would use that like a big axe. I mean, they would be beheaded, right? The execution for a Queen of England was a beheading, but rather than have the executioner use some kind of big axe, Henry sent for the best headsman in Europe, who was known for doing it very quickly, very painlessly, and he used a sword instead of the axe. We laugh at this, like, what does she care? She's still dead, right? I mean, it's not so great. However, we're going to see as we're going to learn this next paragraph, and I'm almost done. So if you have questions or comments, please put them in the comments. But nevertheless, even if a person is liable to the death penalty and they're going to be executed, we're not going to inflict needless suffering on them, nor needless degradation of the body, right? Their execution is actually their atonement. So they've paid the price, and so now that they've been executed, they actually can be restored to their place in the world to come, at least to some place in the world to come. So let's continue. So the Gemara suggests, if so, all the more so. Fire itself fulfills the requirement of burning. Let us surround her with bundles of branches and burn her with them. And the Gemara responds, it comes from a verbal analogy between the word burning stated here and the word burning stated in the context of the death of the sons of Aaron. Just as below, with regard to the sons of Aaron, the verse states that they were burned with fire, and it was a burning of the soul, but the body remained, as even their clothes were not burned, so too here, with regard to the daughter of a priest, it means the burning of the soul, but the body remains. And the Gemara challenges, well, let us execute her with boiling water heated by fire. And the Gemara answers, it is due to the statement of Rav Nachman, as Rav Nachman said that the verse states, and you shall love your fellow as yourself. What does it mean? In this context, when executing someone, you select for him a kind death. Even when someone must be executed, his dignity should be protected. He or she should be executed in the most comfortable way possible. It doesn't help the person that much who's being executed, but nevertheless, we don't inflict needless pain, even if they become liable to the death penalty, nor do we desecrate the body. And that's why also, if somebody was going to be a different kind of execution where it was going to be done publicly and their body was going to be exposed, you would only leave that body there until nightfall, and then you take it down. And for the same reason, you shall love your fellow as yourself. Even though that person became liable to an execution, you're going to get their body buried in the ground within 24 hours, as you would do for any Jew. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us check our comments and questions. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to scan the comments because Nina had left me a note that she had to go pick up the kids. So hold on. Let me see if I can spot comments. Just bear with me. Nina said, I have to run out. So won't be monitoring comments, but Sal will scroll through at the end if I'm not back. Okay. Bill Eldridge says, is there such a thing as an unperforated grill? Wouldn't that be a griddle? Thank you. Okay, so that's the difference in English. An unperforated grill is a griddle. But they're called a grill, remember the old McDonald's, right? It was just like the flat thing, right? And Burger King was flame broiled, right? Because they had the wire grill and the flames were coming up. Wasn't that the difference? At least back in the 70s when they actually cooked the meat. No more. I will say nothing further. Okay. I'm looking for comments. Okay. Oh, Michael Stein comments, yesterday we lost our beloved Rabbi Yisrael Rappaport, a shliach of the Rebbe to Vineland, New Jersey, meaning he was a Chabad rabbi. May Rabbi Yisrael Rappaport's memory always be for a blessing. In fact, I just heard of this death, so Baruch Dayan Emes, we say blessed is the true judge. That's what we say when we hear of a death, and then we wish him that his soul should have a great aliyah, and may all the mourners be comforted. And we say amen. Okay, just finishing to scan the comments. Okay, so I'm not really seeing questions or comments over there on Facebook, nor on the YouTube side. Okay, so hopefully it was clear. All right, my friends, thank you for listening today. With God's help, we'll be together tomorrow, the usual Friday time. That's noon Pacific, and we'll be opening our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 7. May the people who are mourning now the death of Rabbi Rappaport and anyone who has lost someone recently be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. We say amen. And just one last thought. There's a video going around on WhatsApp. It's easy to find. There was an incident, I think it was in Pennsylvania, after this massive snowstorm, where with neighbors, there was a husband and wife who lived across the street from some man, and they started getting into a feud, like a neighborhood feud, because they were shoveling snow onto each other's driveways. And there's actual video with audio footage of this screaming furious argument they got into. You don't even know what they're arguing about, but they're calling each other horrible names and cursing, etc. And it escalated so much that the man who lived across the street went inside his house, came back out with a gun, shot the woman several times, shot the man several times. They were still moving. They were still talking. They might have survived. Then this man went back inside his house, got a rifle, came out, shot the woman a couple times again, shot the man a couple times. The couple died. Then this man went inside and killed himself. Over what? Over some kind of argument about shoveling snow? Over calling each other names for a long period of time in the past, that these neighbors started to hate each other, and for that, all three are now dead? I'm only sharing this story to say, there's a lot of crazy people out there. Let's pray for all of us and everyone we know and all our loved ones and all our friends and our entire nation and the whole world to choose peace. Let's choose peace. Why go there to such an angry, furious place that people could end up dying over snow shoveling? Please, God, teach us your ways, because all your ways are ways of peace. I say amen and have a good night.